All right, so it's hard to think about philanthropy and generosity without thinking about admiration. Admiration for the people who give of themselves to benefit other people. And although psychologists are somewhat leery about talking about human universals, this is one I'm pretty happy to stake my reputation on, that around the planet we like people who give of themselves to others, and we don't like people who just are in life for themselves. We want to be around other people who are selfless, and we'd rather, all things considered, avoid people who are just in the world for selfish reasons. And if you don't believe me, just think for a moment about your stereotype of nurses and charitable givers, people who benefit other people out there in the world, versus, say, Wall Street bankers, who arguably are in it for other motivations. Perhaps economists in the room are the only ones who wouldn't quite resonate with that idea. But this is not a novel thing. This is not something new with the 21st century. Throughout human history, we seem to value those people who give of themselves. So going back to Aquinas and ancient philosophers, the ability to care about other people, to be selflessness, has been considered the pinnacle of moral development. Most of the world's religions identify sinful behavior with selfish behavior and suggest that the pathway to heaven or to some glorious afterlife is filled with your concern for other people in one way or another. And of course, we don't need any kind of national survey to understand that the people who give of themselves are those that we consider saints, that we really admire out there in the world, that garner some very positive reputation, whereas those people out there in the world who are really in it for themselves are the people that we don't admire very much, who earn very negative reputations, who are people that we would otherwise want to punish in a number of different ways. I'm interested not so much directly in the research I'm going to tell you about today in why people behave in saintly or selfish ways, although I think the stuff I'm going to talk about matters for that. Instead, I'm more interested in something a little, maybe one step removed from this, and that is how we evaluate people like this. That is, how do we evaluate selfless versus selfish behavior? And I think this matters for motivation, how our own behavior towards other people, because, of course, our behavior towards others is guided by a number of different motivations. One is how we feel about the action as well. If we despise or if we dislike a particular action on our behalf, we're unlikely to do it. If we evaluate selfishness negatively, we're less likely to do it ourselves. If we evaluate selflessness positively, we're more likely to do it. If we garner positive reputations out there in the world, we receive praise and awards and friends. When we behave selflessly, we're more likely to do it. If we get punished and despised and ignored and rejected when we behave selfishly, we're less likely to do it. But in between these extremes of what you might argue complete selfless behavior on the one hand and completely selfish behavior on the other hand is an entire range of gray area. Gray area that varies in just how selfish it is or just how selfless it is. And what I want to know is, what does the slope of the line between these two extremes of evaluation look like? So it's true that a kid who steals a cookie from his buddy and eats all of it will be judged more negatively than one who gives all of his cookie to a buddy. But what about the child who just steals one bite and leaves the rest, or two or three, versus one who gives a bite, or two or three, to a friend? What about the professor who gives an hour a week to his students versus one who gives 2 or 3 or 4 or 5? How caring is that person likely to seem? What is the slope of this line? What does the topography of selfless actions look like across between these two extremes? There are a number of different possibilities. You can imagine reasons for lots of different shapes in here. The most obvious one is that there's just a simple linear line. If we value prosociality in other people, we admire it, we judge them favorably for it, then the more you show of it, the more favorably I ought to judge you. Very simple prediction. Many things out there in the world are linear. Perhaps this is one of them. Another possibility suggested by some psychology research is a little more complicated pattern, maybe an inverted U. That we like people who are kind of selfless, that are pretty good to other people, but people who are really, really nice, really, really selfless, they threaten us a little bit, right? They make us feel maybe not so good about ourselves, and so we derogate do-gooders just a little bit. Maybe it looks like that. Another possibility is something that looks like this, more of an asymptotic pattern where we value selflessness up to a point, after which it's all gravy, it just doesn't matter. A little bit of kindness perhaps goes a long way. You can imagine other shapes too. Maybe there's a quadratic function or an exponential kind of function where, because of the relative rarity of selflessness, when we actually see selflessness out there in the world, that's what we really admire in other people, what we really judge favorably. But a number of different possibilities. What does the topography of generosity look like? find out, I'm going to describe just a couple of different experiments that Nadav Klein, who is sitting right over there, and I have done. Nadav is really the one who's responsible for these ideas and for the research that's been done as well. And the first place we looked, or one of the places we looked, I should say, is right here on campus, not all that far from us. So Nadav, right over there, went right here on campus. This is Mandel Hall, not too far from us here in Booth. We're right there, and he went over there, to University of Chicago orchestra concert. It's actually right over there is where Mandel Hall is. And the University of Chicago orchestra concert is interesting for us because they don't charge for admission. Instead, they rely on your generosity to support them. And what they do to help out with this a little bit is they give you a suggested donation amount. So they suggest a $10 donation at the door for the charity, or for the orchestra, but you can give, of course, whatever you like. What Nadav did was he put a questionnaire in the programs that orchestra goers received when they walked in, and then left a little box at the end for them to put the questionnaire in when they left. And what we asked them to do was to consider Tom W. Now, Tom W. is just somebody we described to them, somebody who'd gone to other orchestra concerts like these as an orchestra goer. We gave them a little bit of information about Tom W., including at the end, we told them how much Tom W. donated at a recent concert. And what we said was Tom either donated 0, donated 10, which is the suggested donation amount, or doubled the suggested donated amount and gave $20. We then asked people to evaluate Tom across a number of different dimensions to report their impression of Tom on some kind of basic reputational measures. And although you can evaluate other people in lots of different ways, psychologists have generally found that you evaluate people in one of two different ways. Either you evaluate how interpersonally warm they are, how friendly, how kind, how caring they are. These are the dimensions that lead you to want to become friends with somebody versus avoid them. Or you evaluate them in terms of their competence, how smart and intelligent they are. We measured both. We found no effects at all on competence anywhere in our experiments, so I won't describe those. What I'm going to show you are the places where we expected to see some movement, namely on warmth. Things like how good-natured, how tolerant, how sincere, how caring is this person. And what did we find? Well, we found something that looks like an asymptotic pattern. So these were 1 to 7 scales. They reported their reputation of Tom or their evaluation of Tom. When Tom gave nothing, they didn't like him very well. They didn't form a very positive impression of Tom. When he gave 10, they formed a more positive reputation or a positive impression of Tom. But when Tom doubled the donation amount and gave 20, it didn't seem to matter. Didn't judge him any more favorably than when he just donated 10. We followed this up in other experiments, one in which we changed what the suggested donation amount was. So in a large online survey with nearly 500 participants, we varied what the suggested donation was. Either we said nothing at this orchestra concert, $10, $20, or $50, and then we varied how much the protagonist they were evaluating gave, 0, 5, 10, 20, or 50. And here's what we found. So consider this first bar here, this first line here, where there was no suggested donation, so anything would be kind of considered a pro-social action. You can see that they judged Tom less favorably when he donated 0 than when they donated something. But beyond that, it didn't seem to matter. That is, none of these numbers in the gray area are significantly higher than this one down here. And that's true in all of these cases, that anything at or above the suggested donation amount was judged the same in these experiments, statistically speaking. But everything below it was judged progressively more negatively the more selfish they became. That is, people seemed to value selfishness, so the more selfish you were, the more negatively you were evaluated. But they didn't seem to value generosity. The more generously you behaved, they didn't form a more positive impression of you. Consider another experiment that we did to see whether this is a pattern that replicates consistently. It's a very simple experiment where we asked visitors to the Museum of Science and Industry to evaluate Bob D. Bob D, we said, came into our laboratory and participated in a dictator game. The economists in the room will know what this is. A very simple thing. We gave Bob $6, and we told Bob that he could give some amount of it to another person in the experiment. And we said that Bob either gave 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or $6 to the other person. You just evaluated one of those different outcomes. We then had people evaluate Bob's personality across a number of dimensions, a number of different traits, how much he cared for others, how much he was generally motivated by selfishness out there in his life. but also how much he generally donated to charity. So one concern with the data that I showed you just a moment ago is that we may just have a ceiling effect. That is, our measure isn't sensitive enough to measure really positive evaluations of somebody because it's capped there at 7 on the scale. So how much you give to charity as an index of how caring you are in general is an unbounded measure. You could go as high as you want. There's no ceiling on that, so that's not prone to a ceiling effect concern. And what do we find? Well, we find that when Bob is relatively selfish, gives 0, 1, or 2, you judge Bob in line with the amount that Bob gives, more negatively as Bob gives less and less and less in terms of his care for others. But as Bob behaves more generously, gives more than half, right, suffers a cost to give you money, it matters nothing for how much you seem to think that he cares for other people. That's true for how selfish you think Bob is. You hit the floor on this measure. Just when you're at the equitable outcome, you don't get any lower than that. But we also see it on the unbounded measure, how much Bob gives to charity. So when he's really generous, gives everything to the other person in this case, you don't think he necessarily gives more to other people than when he just gives 3. Again, people seem to value selfishness here, but they don't seem to value generosity. And if you look at the slopes on these lines, in all cases, the slopes on the relatively selfish actions are very strong and significant, suggests that we are sensitive to the degree of selfishness that we see in somebody. You judge them more negatively as they behave more selfishly. But the beta weights on the positive actions, the selfless actions, are all flat. None of them differ significantly from 0, suggesting that we don't value increasing levels of generosity. An asymptotic function here, perhaps. And we have a number of other demonstrations like this, but really what we want to know as psychologists or even as economists trying to understand how this works out there in the world is why. Why are people insensitive to generosity? Surely they're not all the time. Why are they in this case? Well, there's a fundamental feature of human judgment, and that is in order for us to be rational and sensible and sensitive to the scope of almost anything, we have to be able to judge something in comparison. Right? So our judgments of almost anything, how happy we are, how tall we are, how much of a disaster something is judged in context relative to something else. And although we might not always be sensitive to the way in which the context or comparisons are affecting our judgment, we know very fundamentally that the context has a big effect on how you evaluate any single event. And as my colleague Chris Shee has shown over and over again, if you're going to get people sensitive to the magnitude or to the scope of anything, they have to be able to judge it in comparison to something else. So a disaster that kills 10,000 seabirds is worse than a disaster that kills 5,000 seabirds, only if you consider the one that kills 5,000 when you're evaluating the one that kills 10,000. If you just evaluate 10,000 on its own and don't think about other comparison outcomes, then you're not going to be sensitive to the scope of the disaster. Now, why might you be sensitive to the scope of selfishness, but not to the scope of generosity? Well, we know there are a few things that elicit the kind of careful, deliberate processing that would make you spontaneously engage in certain kinds of comparison. Negative stuff, negative outcomes, negative actions are one thing that we know elicits more deliberate processing. If you think more carefully, when something bad happens to you, when somebody punches you in the face, you wonder, why in the hell did that person do that? But when somebody pats you on the back, you might not think much of it. So there's an asymmetry here. Bad stuff, negative stuff tends to elicit more deliberate processing. Positive actions, not so much, not so deliberate processing. Negative outcomes like selfish actions then might be sensitive to the magnitude or the scope or the context of the action, whereas positive actions like generosity are just kind of taken at face value. You don't think about comparison cases. So when somebody mugs you on the street, right, takes your wallet, you might think, well, not so bad, he could have killed me. That is, you keep it in context. But when somebody then comes and returns your wallet to you, does something nice to you, you might not keep it in context. You probably don't think, well, he could have given me some spending money too. Right? If you keep selfishness in context but don't keep generosity in context, then you're going to be insensitive to the magnitude of generosity, but are going to be sensitive to the magnitude of selfishness. So the prediction then from this is that you will care about the degree of generosity. You will keep it in context if we make you keep it in context. That is, if we rub the degree of generosity in your nose and show you all of the different possible things you could have done, then you'll be sensitive to how generous somebody is. But we won't need to do that for you to be generous, to be sensitive to different degrees of selfishness. So consider this experiment we did that does this. So we had people consider, this was actually inspired by an actual event here at the university. We had people consider a professor in this case, who had won an award in one case. This is the giving away condition. They had won an award, $80,000 award, and they were deciding to give some of it away to a charitable organization. Okay? And they gave away some amount of money, 10,000, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, up to 80. Right? In the other condition, they imagined the same professor, who in this case found $80,000 on the street and was going to return it to the police, but before turning it to the police, took some amount of money out of it. Either nothing, $10,000, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, or $80,000. Right? So you have increasing degrees of generosity here, or increasing degrees of selfishness. And what we then manipulated was whether people evaluated only one of these outcomes. Right? You hear this professor who donated $30,000, and you evaluate just how nice that action was. Or you evaluate all of them. Person gives 10,000, 20, you evaluate all of them. How nice was that action? You do that for the positive actions or for the negative actions. And what do we find in this? Well, first, this is the donation condition. This is when our professor gets an $80,000 award and decides to give none of it to this charity that he's considering. You judge that to be not so nice, a little negative on the, down here on the scale. But when he gives something, $10,000, that's really nice, you think. Really nice. And in fact, it never gets any nicer. These are people who evaluate only one action, just one action. Giving 10,000, giving anything is just as nice as giving everything. Now, of course, you know it is not. It is not. The person who gives $10,000 should not be admired as much as the person who gives $80,000. But if thinking just about the person who gives 10 doesn't lead you to think, well, he could have given it all away, well, then you're going to be pretty happy. You're going to be pretty. You're going to think this is a pretty admirable action. What about the selfish case? The case where the professor finds money on the street and pilfers some of it, takes some of it out of there before returning it to the police. Well, if he takes none of it, this is this first column here, you think that's pretty nice. He returns all $80,000. That's a generous action. But notice that you're relatively sensitive. Your judgments get more and more negative about this professor. You consider it progressively less and less nice as he gives less and less and less. Right? That is, your judgment of selfishness, even when you're just evaluating one action alone, is sensitive to scope or magnitude in a way that judgment of generosity is not. Now, to show that you actually can become sensitive to generosity, here's the within subjects case, the case where you evaluate all of the options. And here we see now people are pretty sensitive to it. So you still judge donating nothing, not to be so nice. But now when you judge 10, 20, 30, 40, you see here now, you see a significant increase in this. That you judge giving $10,000 to be not quite as nice as giving $80,000. You keep generosity in context. But in order for you to do that, we have to rub your nose in the context. That is, we have to stick it right in front of your face. You have to judge every single outcome. What about for selfish actions? Selfish actions doesn't require us to rub your nose in the context. Doesn't require the within subject design. We see that it reduces some noise here. You get a little more linearity. But notice that the slope is still the same. Just as you did in the between subjects case. In the within subjects case, you recognize that stealing $10,000 is not as bad as stealing $80,000. So why do we care about this? I think we care about it for a number of fundamental reasons that have to do with, in some ways, I think, over-appreciating small acts of kindness. You can imagine lots of ways in which that's a really good thing in life. It turns out giving somebody a small act of kindness is a way to make them disproportionately happy compared to the cost that you incur. That could be a great thing. But I think for those of you in the room who are actually thinking about philanthropy, how do you solve this problem of giving people who have lots of money to give lots more? I think the data that I've shown you here is something of a barrier. If people evaluate their own small acts of kindness, or those from others, to be just as admirable, to be just as desirable, they glow just as warmly when they do a little good thing as when they do a really good thing, this is an obvious barrier to giving a lot. And so I think it might be useful to keep this message in mind. When giving relatively little is admired a lot, then giving a lot may happen relatively little. If something small seems as good as something big, then you'll do the small thing, perhaps, and not the big thing. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions?
Yes, in the back.
So I was wondering with the figure game. So tools, right? But suppose at 10, you can pull out your own wallet and give the guy $1. I bet you'll get
You
it.
can give more.
Right? And then suppose that at some point, because your wallet's empty, you can commit that you're going to use part of your paycheck to give to this guy.
So all I will say about that is that it's an empirical question. I resonate with the intuition that that sounds somehow going above and beyond the call of duty that you'll be sensitive to. But I thought that giving $4 would do that too. And that giving 5 and giving 6 would do the same out of 6. And it didn't. Just didn't. So it may be that a really unusual action like that calls to mind other things that you wouldn't have had to do that would make you sensitive. That could be unexpectedness, for instance. Something unexpected happens to you. That tends to trigger deliberate processing in the same way that negative information does. So that's possible that that's something that could make you sensitive to generosity when people do something that's unexpected, an unexpected act of generosity. That could be. It's still, I would want to know, is it sensitive to scope? And I suspect it's not. If you pull out your wallet and you give this guy $100, that'll be the same as pulling out your wallet and giving him $1. When of course we know it's not. It's not. Giving somebody $100 is a nicer thing to do than giving $1. But when you pull out $1, you don't think, well, you could have given me $100. Then you judge them the same.
I agree with you that if I pull $1 or $2 out of the wallet, it's the same. But in terms of the practical implication, just breaking down the giving into this sort of like smaller chunks of different actions, so that you get more of, oh, it's not giving, it's the $1 back and then putting out your wallet and then committing to something else, creates this sort of like step.
Yeah, I think that's going to create a barrier to giving for people. It's going to seem harder. It's going to seem more out there. So I think a thing that would help people keep generosity in context is to know what the context is. So consider, for instance, the orchestra experiment I showed you at the beginning. It turned out that one of our participants in that experiment reported giving $90, paying $90. I'm guessing that we could quite dramatically increase the amount that was given at that concert if we told them what the actual context was. Right? If we showed them what the outlier on the far right hand was. Somebody gives $90, then giving your $10 doesn't seem quite so impressive anymore, does it?
Right, and do you think that because they knew going in that the ask amount was $10, that when you asked them to judge somebody that gave 20, 30, and 40, that they didn't want to judge those people higher because if they didn't give, they didn't feel as nice, like maybe they're only going to give their 10. So if they say that the 20, 30, 40, 50 was more better, so that they would then feel bad about what they gave.
Right, so we asked people how much they actually gave at the end of the experiment. And we didn't find that it had a big effect on how they evaluated other people.
Okay.
There was one wrinkle in that. Nadav, wasn't it the people who gave nothing who evaluated people who gave something more favorably? I thought that was the finding. We were expecting that derogation effect because some existing empirical research had led us to consider that possibility. When we looked for it there with that, we didn't find it. So it wasn't the case that if you gave $10, you judged a person who gave 20 more negatively. It just didn't happen. Just didn't happen.
Thank you, yes.
Oh, okay, we're done.